Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be here with you all. I'm delighted to be here and enjoying all of the discussions and the talks that we've been hearing. So we've heard philosophical talks, historical talk, and theological talks. I'm going to revert to the historical because that's what I know best. And talk a little bit about Catholicism and the sciences in the pre-modern period, mostly in the scientific revolution, but also a little bit back into the Middle Ages as well. So whenever speaking about the interactions between Christianity and in particular Catholicism and the sciences, I think it's useful for us first to say something about what the current widespread opinion is on the matter of the interactions. And then as a historian, I'd like to say a few words about why that widespread opinion exists. Well, then the first important thing for me to note is the wide gap between what professional historians of science think and what is commonly believed by the general public. And even, I must say, among some academics outside the history of science and outside of this room. Today, historians of science see the interaction between science and religion as complex and varied and not able to be reduced into simplistic notions. We recognize the need to look closely at individuals and individual events, to recognize changing times, different locales, and perhaps most of all, the different theologies in the different religions, and today, especially, the very different theology between Christian denominations. Catholicism, for example, is not, thank God, American fundamentalism. We heard a bit this morning a reference to atheistic humanists, and generally in my relations with fellow humans, I think I would rather be around atheistic humanists than American fundamentalists for the most part. That said, several very prominent historians have summed up the overall interactions, at least in the early modern period between Catholicism and science, in the following ways. John Heilbrunn, in his 2009 book, Sun in the Church, which examines the use of cathedrals as solar observatories, concludes that, quote, "The Roman Catholic Church gave more financial and social support to the study of astronomy for over 6 centuries, from the recovery of ancient learning during the late Middle Ages into the Enlightenment, than any other and probably all other institutions." And one of my own mentors, Richard Westphal, argued that the Catholic Church was the major patron of the arts and sciences until the advent of governmental patronage in the 20th century. And I'll just point out that neither of those two historians are Catholics, so you can't accuse them of being apologists. Well, despite such statements from the historians who know best, quite a different view is found among the general public and is repeated and reinforced by popular writers, journalists, bloggers, as well as by some self-appointed spokesmen for science. And their frequently negative view of the relationship between Catholicism and science has been rejected by historians today. But, and here's what I find interesting, their view is actually something that's been passed down as a kind of folklore for over a century, and its origins lie in social and political context of the past. And let's see now. There we are. The chief crafter of this narrative was John William Draper, himself a chemist and photographer and physiologist, and his book, The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, which was published in 1874, is not actually about religion in general, but is instead a long, very long, and hysterical anti-Catholic polemic. Although he promises his readers a fair and impartial statement, he then writes, "Roman Christianity and science are recognized by their respective adherents as being absolutely incompatible." Do you agree? They cannot exist together. Mankind must make its choice. It cannot have both. On the other hand, he considers Protestantism the twin sister of science, and therefore he argues that any persecution of science done by Protestants is because they have been, quote, incompletely emancipated from Catholicism. Well, the book contains barely a single bit of reliable historical information. Nonetheless, it continues to be read, and even a generation ago, even some historians of science relied upon it. In fact, nearly 100 years later, the historian of science at Princeton University, Charles Gillespie, wrote that there can simply be no doubt that Protestant and bourgeois milieux have encouraged talent and ambition to rise through science, and that Catholic and aristocratic milieu have inhibited the development of scientists. This is just 1960. I mean, I know I'm older than a lot of the people in this room, but 1960 was not that long ago. Well, Draper's claims have become common knowledge, and they originate in and perpetuate conditions of 19th century America. He expresses a typical anti-Catholicism of Anglophone cultures, 19th century racism against newly arriving Catholic immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and of course Poland. And his views also depend upon a personal animosity towards his sister, who converted to Catholicism. But his book also became popular on the European continent. As late 19th century political movements came to oppose the secular power of the Catholic Church, anti-clericalism flourished. And since these movements also embraced progressivism, they supported the era's chief emblem of progress, science and technology. So it was sort of natural for them to create this dichotomy of conflict between Catholicism and science and technology. So it was politically expedient to claim that the Catholic Church was opposed to science and progress. This was particularly true in Italy, where unification had just taken place and the Pope was a virtual prisoner within the Vatican. And in the 20th century, communist regimes likewise continued the anti-religion and particularly anti-Catholic myth for their own political purposes. Now, interestingly enough, this myth became part of mainstream historical narratives of the scientific revolution. It was impossible for historians to ignore, I assume that this is a person that needs no introduction in this room, it was impossible for historians to ignore Nicholas Copernicus as a major figure at the start of the scientific revolution, and likewise of Galileo as his champion and the founder of classical kinematics, both of them, of course, Catholic. But it was also the case that these two were generally presented as the most persecuted by the Church. Notably, after Galileo's trial and house arrest in 1633, most narratives of the scientific revolution leave the continent for England, rarely to return thereafter, and instead carry on in a very English line to Newton. So in other words, what I'm saying is that, the Catholic continent has been written out of the narratives of the scientific revolution in its traditional form. I'll mention, just as a humorous point, that if any of you have seen my little book on the scientific revolution, a very short introduction, one of the reviewers of that book's criticism before it was published was that it contained too many Catholics. But to return to Copernicus, when I was looking for this image of his face produced in Warsaw forensically a few years ago from his skull, I was dismayed to read the article about it on the physics site phys.org, because it repeated every conceivable error about Copernicus and the Church. That is, that Copernicanism was declared heretical in 1616. It was not. That Copernicus's book was banned. It was not. That his book caused religious upheaval when published in 1543, it did not. Quite the contrary, Copernicus was, of course, not only Catholic, but in holy orders as a cathedral canon, and much of his support came from within the Catholic hierarchy, and particularly the papal court. His book was dedicated to Pope Paul III. In 1515, Paul's predecessor, Leo X, invited him to Rome to work on calendrical reform, and the prefaces to his book reproduce letters from various church officials who have supported his work and urged its completion and publication. Galileo, too, despite his celebrated difficulties with church officials, was and remained Catholic, and there's no reason to question the sincerity of his faith. And in fact, it's recently been discovered in the archives that he was actually tonsured by the Bishop of Florence in 1630, so apparently took some minor level of holy orders for reasons that we still do not know. Well, it's easy to list important Catholic contributors to the scientific revolution to the point of exhaustion. I will try not to exhaust you. But among the misunderstood, we could mention Andreas Vesalius, the famous anatomist of Brussels, whose human dissections corrected many errors inherited from the Greco-Roman author Galen. Now, there is a persistent myth about Vesalius that he had to do dissections in secret in the middle of the night, and that he died when being forced to go on a penitential pilgrimage to the Holy Land in order to remove the sin of his human dissections. But there's absolutely no basis to that. In fact, he did die on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, but it had nothing to do with expiation of some sin. It's untrue that the myth that the Catholic Church forbade dissections. Unfortunately, I was also in Padua going to their anatomy theater. I brought a bunch of students there a couple of years ago, and we heard this same nonsense coming from the tour guide saying that the windows had to be blocked up so that people couldn't peer in and find out that people were doing dissections in the university. Well, who do you think ran the university? I mean, I had to take my poor students aside and correct this error. I thought it was useless to try and do that to the tour guide. In fact, recent archival work has indicated that Vesalius sometimes performed his human dissections in Padua inside churches because they provided the largest assembly places. Another Fleming, Johann Baptista van Helmont, was one of the most innovative and influential voices in 17th century medicine and chemistry, also a devout Catholic with very strong mystical leanings. He was particularly impressed by Thomas à Kempis and other Flemish mystics. It's also easy to cite a long list of scientific works and achievements carried out by those in holy orders. In the middle of the 17th century, concepts of atomism were extended by the French priest Pierre Gassendi, who revived the ideas of Epicurus, and in the memorable phrase coined by the historian of science Margaret Osler, baptized these pagan ideas in ways that made them acceptable to Christians. He was also the first person to observe a transit of Mercury in 1633. He also replicated Galileo's experiments, not tremendously successfully. It was the idea of impressed motion, of, if you drop a heavy object from the top of the mast of a moving ship, it falls to the bottom of the mast, not to the back of the ship. He didn't do it on shipboard, but he had people galloping on horses, throwing balls to each other. Didn't work really well, but it was an attempt to replicate his experiments. The foundational principles of geology, stratigraphy, were enunciated by Niels Stenson, or Nicholas Steno, who converted from Lutheranism to Catholicism, became a priest, a bishop, and is now a beatus. During his extensive work as an anatomist, he discovered, among other things, the salivary duct, which is still known by his name as Stenson's duct. So you can think about that over dinner. A list of 17th century Jesuits reads like a roster of significant scientific discoverers. In the 1650s, Giovanni Battista Riccioli measured, fairly accurately, the constant of gravitational acceleration by dropping weights from the towers in Bologna. One of the amusing parts about this is he had to have a good timekeeping mechanism, which he didn't with 17th century clocks. So he endeavored to get a pendulum that would beat exactly once per second. Well, what's the only timing instrument you actually have without a clock? You have the sun, how often it crosses the meridian. So he would make a pendulum, and then he would have the Jesuit novices sit there and count the number of beats for 24 hours while he watched to see when the sun crossed the meridian the next day. I assume he got a night's sleep in the meantime. And when it didn't work, he would either lengthen or shorten the string to get the pendulum right. Eventually, the Jesuit novices revolted and said, no way, we're not doing this anymore, and instead stood at the bottom of the towers and chanted very rapidly a well-known chant, and they would see what point on the towers, what syllables they were saying, and that seemed to have worked just as well. He also mapped the moon telescopically, giving its prominent craters in Maria the names we use today. One of my favorites, of course, is this man, Athanasius Kircher. He had a museum in Rome of wonders, both mechanical and natural, but my favorite story about him is that he was in Sicily when there was an earthquake. We became interested in what the motion was from, and just after that, Mount Vesuvius erupted for the first time in about 400 years. And so what he did is to determine the source of the fire, descended into the crater of Vesuvius while it was erupting to try and find the source of I have this image of him with his cassock and beretta flapping in the breeze, being lowered on ropes. I'm sure it didn't happen that way, but that's the way I imagine it. He concluded, therefore, that there was so much fire and molten rock that it could not come only from the mountain itself, that the Earth's core must itself be molten. There must be fires burning under the Earth. So another one, Francesco Maria Grimaldi, first described and studied diffraction of light. The Jesuits, as it's recently been shown by a book by a historian colleague of mine, that the Jesuits were the first to teach Galileo's new science of motion in their Roman college. And not to keep on with it, I'll just say, if you've ever done the experiment of taking a piece of paper over a magnet and sprinkling iron filings on it, that was two Jesuits, Garzoni and Niccolo Cabello, that came up with that idea. And it was a way of trying to make the invisible visible, to try and pursue, so you don't, part of this is to discern what is miraculous, what is divine intervention, but what is in fact just a purely natural thing. So they're trying to visualize what we now call the lines of force. In addition to talking about individuals, we need also to talk about institutions. So the religious orders, namely the support given to those in holy orders, especially among the Dominicans, Franciscans, Jesuits, Benedictines, and the other orders, as well as countless abbés, obviously facilitated the ability to study the natural world. The orders built the first global networks of correspondence and exchange, with new scientific information and material flowing back to Spain, Rome, Paris, and other centers from far-flung missionaries in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The idea particularly of the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and the Jesuits that had an organized central authority meant that there could in fact be this worldwide web of correspondence and exchange. In fact, it is in fact the first kind of globality. The Franciscans in the New World preserved the knowledge of indigenous peoples and transmitted much of their knowledge about local flora and fauna back to Europe. And as well as the other sort of institutions are scientific societies. The first of these organized in Italy. The earliest of these, the Accademia dei Lincei, was founded in Rome in 1603. Now, it did collapse with the death of its founder and patron in 1632. Nevertheless, it was revived by Pius IX in the mid-19th century and became the foundation of the current Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Many other scientific societies followed across Italy, including the Accademia del Cimento, founded in Florence in 1657, that brought together many experimentalists and former students of Galileo. Later, the Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris, back, oh dear. Oh, there we are. These are the members of the Academy of Science in Paris presenting their work to Louis XIV. And you can see one of the people in the front is an abbé. There were actually 4 abbés in the society at this time. And of course, in France, these were a majority of Catholic members, such as Gian Domenico Cassini, famed for his observations of Jupiter and Saturn, and Wilhelm Homberg, a convert to Catholicism from Lutheranism, and one of the most renowned and productive chemists of his day. Well, finally, historians of science now recognize that the impressive developments of the period that's called the Scientific Revolution depended in large part on positive contributions and foundations that date from the High Middle Ages. The Church's medieval establishment and financing of universities, the development of a culture of disputation, and the logical rigor of scholastic theology all helped to provide a culture necessary for the scientific revolution. And now I'd like to show you a wonderful discovery I made in northern Italy in the Franciscan church in Bolzano. Oh, come on, back. There we are. This is the wall of the Franciscan church of Bolzano. And interestingly enough, instead of having the walls decorated with various saints and biblical characters, these are all the Franciscan professors of theology. And I do think I would say that it would be nice for more churches to be decorated with professors. And of course, what are they doing? They are professors because all they're doing is arguing with one another. And this is, you know, and I say that only partially as a joke. If we don't have disputation, if we don't have disagreement, then what do we have? We never get anywhere. And that level of scholastic disputation, remember the medieval university was built on oral argument all the time. That sets a culture for disputation that's absolutely necessary for the sciences. And I'll take it one step further. We often, as we're trying to explain the relationships between science and religion, try to downplay conflict. But sometimes conflict's okay. It really is okay, because that's the way we solve problems. It's better than sweeping them under the rug. So we don't always want to say that, oh, well, harmonious, harmonious, harmonious. Sometimes a little bit of conflict is what you need before you can have harmonious. So I've spoken about individuals and institutions thus far. So in my last few moments, I'd like to say something about general aspects of Christianity, Catholic Christianity in particular, that foster historically scientific discovery. The first we heard from Professor Barr already this morning is the doctrine of the two books, enunciated by several patristic authors and most fully by St. Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century. So the African doctor argued that God reveals himself to humanity in two different ways. On the one hand, by inspiring human authors to pen the book of Scripture, and on the other, by the very act of creating the universe, which Augustine called the book of nature. And if one can learn to read the book of nature by studying it, one discovers ever more about its creator. And since the two books have the same author, they must of necessity be consistent. Therefore, one can use one to help understand the other. Now, before I leave that point, I must say that in the modern world, certainly to some of my students when I say that, they think this sounds like biblical literalism, but that's definitely, of course, not how Augustine or any later theologian for many centuries afterwards saw it. Because Augustine explicitly states that both books require careful interpretation. The Bible was written in a way accommodated to its original audience, so while containing truth, the truth is not on the surface and has to be teased out. And the book of nature is just the same. What we see is not often the way, what we see is often not the way things are. And he cites the example of the broken stick. That is, you put a stick into a glass of water, and because of refraction, it looks like it's broken. But of course, it's not. That's a function of, it's an illusion. Critically, and I think this is remarkable, he says that the Bible is harder to interpret correctly than is the physical universe. And in part, this is because we can explore the world, for example, by experiment, in ways we can't with Scripture. So his final conclusion which is crucial to the development of medieval and early modern science, an anathema to the modern fundamentalist, namely that the Bible has to be interpreted in the light of demonstrable truths about the physical world, not the other way around. The value of the natural world is also undergirded by the incarnation, when God thought his creation good enough to enter into physically. The natural world is not evil. It is not neutral. It is not a distraction from God. It is good as God's creation, and in a real sense, creation is his first revelation of himself. The idea of the inherent worth of the natural world as God's good creation expressed itself also in the Middle Ages in a bias towards naturalistic explanations of phenomena. completely contrary to popular conceptions of the Middle Ages, at least in the United States, medieval thinkers were extremely reluctant to use divine intervention as an explanation. This was seen as giving up to ignorance. And natural causes for natural things have to be sought out. As St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, quote, "What is more foolish than to say God does something just because he can?" The general idea was that at creation, God implanted powers or natures within the physical universe, and these natures thereafter have had the power to act as causes to bring about events. We've heard some about this already today. For example, traditional interpreters of Genesis 1 noted that the text reads, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures, not God made living creatures," which they took to imply that the power of generating living forms was implanted in matter at the creation. Indeed, by the 12th century, a group of theologians at the cathedral school at Chartres argued that God's creative activity lasted only the first infinitesimal instant of time in which he did no more than create a primordial chaos of the elements, and those elements, acting by means of their natural powers, formed on their own the world we see today, up to and including the origin of human beings. Well, there is perhaps no more dramatic example of the idea of natural properties acting in nature than in St. Thomas's commentary on Aristotle's Physics. Towards the end of the fifth book, the angelic doctor picks up on the ancient philosopher's favorite image of how the shipbuilder's knowledge has to be applied to wood in order to build a ship, right? So the shipbuilder goes, gets lumber, he knows, he's got the idea of the ship in his head, and then has the wood put together to form the ship. The angelic doctor argues that God does not create the world we see in a similar way. Instead, he says, in the natural world, quote, "It is as if the knowledge of the shipbuilding art were in the wood itself, such that it could move and assemble itself into a ship." If you think about that for a moment, it's a marvelous image. It's a sort of when I read this to one of my students, I think he said, "Oh, it's sort of like the Harry Potter image that of the wood, the trees felling themselves and going together to form a ship." This emphasis on natural explanations is nearly identical to the methodological naturalism that lies at the heart of modern scientific work. Therefore, it's not incorrect to say that methodological naturalism was in fact a creation of medieval theologians. Thus, in conclusion, we have several methods possible for refuting the conflict narrative that I started this talk with, and that remains so widespread. The first step, speaking as a historian, is to get the history right. Thereafter, we can look at a huge roster of individuals who are both Catholic and important scientific minds. But we know that as wonderful as any one of us might be, institutional contexts are needed to supply essential stability and support, and here again we can look to the foundations of the cathedral schools and their offspring, the universities, as well as the religious orders, and of course, the remarkable administrative longevity of the Catholic Church itself. Finally, I've noted how theological commitments can orient a person or a society towards or away from serious, coherent study of the natural world. And I think that Christianity, most notably the Christianity of Western Europe, contained crucial commitments that fostered the idea of natural science in its pursuit. I would say it was a necessary but not sufficient cause for the origins of modern science. Thus, the quotation from Draper that I mentioned at the start of this lecture is revealed as strikingly misguided. Mankind could not have had science as we know it without Catholic Christianity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Principe. Do we have questions now? We have 10 minutes for questions. Am I destroying it? Okay, so I have a question that I would like to ask. So you didn't cover it or much of it in your presentation, but you mentioned Jesuit scientists, and I was wondering, from my study of the history of religion and science, I've learned, I excuse me, I don't remember the names of the authors, but I've read that Jesuits who, unlike Dominicans, got involved with a scientific revolution. They had founded, for example, several hundreds of churches of mathematics in different parts of the world. The criticism that comes from historians is that they did not actually produce a science that would be really changing science much. I mean, scientific theories that would be memorable and that would really bring a significant change. Would you agree with that? And there are several speculations why it happened this way. So I was wondering if you have any opinion on this issue.
Yeah, I think the argument that the Jesuits were maybe not so, quote, successful because they didn't create a Jesuit science, I have two answers to that. The first is the argument itself is based on a particular idea of what science is and what the history, how this history of science works. It's based in I think that it depends upon an older historiography where there are these sort of great revolutions of great men who change everything, and you can rattle off their names, Newton, etc. But does science really go that way? Historians are very skeptical about that idea, that science is a conversation where there are lots of people involved. So you think of Newton's work on optics. Well, he quotes people like Grimaldi. He didn't do Grimaldi's work. Grimaldi did Grimaldi's work. So you may have a Newtonian synthesizer, but there has to be some kind of something to synthesize. And certainly the Jesuits did produce, and all the other religious orders as well, produce large amounts of material that could be synthesized in different ways. The second answer is we talked a little bit about, or one of the speakers spoke a little bit about counterfactual history. Sometimes it's useful to sort of think in that direction. One wonders how different the tenor of modern science would be if, in fact, in the 18th century, it wasn't England that became the world power, but Italy. Now, one of the reasons I say this is that Kircher's work, it's huge amounts of material. When it got to England, the English they didn't know what to do with it. It didn't make sense to them because they were coming out of a completely different vision of what God's interaction with the world is like, a very Protestant, very dissecting rather than holistic view. So part of the way science has developed is, in fact, contingent on non-scientific things. Things might have been different, in other words.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, please come forward. Introduce yourself and ask the question.
Well, I would like to ask, what was the impact of medieval science and thesis made by medieval scientists, for example, Roger Bacon or Robert Gosteste, if their thoughts was remembered and had the impact on the future, or they were forgotten?
Good. That's a wonderful question. Yes, I'll repeat it. Glad to. Whether the contributions of medieval thinkers and medieval natural philosophers were actually known during the time of the scientific revolution, or whether they were forgotten. Yes. Yes. Well, everybody likes to think that their own ideas are new, and there was, in fact, a tendency during the scientific revolution to overemphasize the novelty of what was happening in the 16th and 17th century. So we think, for example, of William Gilbert. He writes this big book on the magnet. Okay? In history of science circles, it's celebrated as this major work of experimentalism, of modeling, and so forth. Virtually the entire book is cribbed out of the 13th century Petrus Peregrinus. But, obviously Gilbert must have known Petrus Peregrinus because he copied what he did. But then later, people who wrote about Gilbert didn't know about this medieval author. The same is true of Galileo in the two new sciences. Look, Galileo taught at the University of Padua. He was trained in the scholastic sciences. He obviously knew the medieval predecessors. In his book, The Two New Sciences, when you start with the very basic principles of kinematics, of how bodies move, the first thing he proves is the mean speed theorem. Well, it sounds very novel. It's the basis of kinematics. But his proof, even his diagram, is taken directly out of Nicole Rem from the 14th century. So yes, these people were known, and their results were used, but often they tended not to be cited very much. And so later generations forgot about the very tight connection between the Middle Ages and the early modern period.
We still have time. Any more questions? Okay, so I will ask the last one, okay? So I was wondering about, again, Middle Ages. Was there an awareness and a practice of division of labor already, that there are people who are doing more of philosophy and theology and those who are doing more natural science? Or the model of Albert the Great is the model, who is doing everything, who is a polymath? So this type of question.
Yeah, that kind of division of labor between people doing everything. You mean more specialized studies of natural things?
Yes.
In general. That seems to start developing probably in the late 14th century, I would say. We have... Let me revise what I'm going to say. So we have the people who are highly trained in theology, who are the doctors of theology, who are also doing natural philosophy. Certainly in the 12th and the 13th century, that's what we see. At some point, there are also people who are highly trained in theology, who are doing the natural sciences, but are not so highly trained in theology. And so this sort of idea of proto-scientist, if we can use that term, although that's not a great term, does start to develop slowly, like Jean Buridan, for example.
How do you think, what brings this shift?
Yes, that's a good question.
Because this is before the scientific revolution.
Yeah, it is. I have my own ideas about periodization. We often see this really strong break between the High Middle Ages and the Renaissance, for example. But a lot of things happened in the 14th century that didn't have to do with intellectual developments, that had to do with very serious social developments, like plagues and famine, that seemed to cut the lines of connection between the two periods much more than the intellectual, if you see what I mean. Why did people just before the disasters of the 14th century start doing that? I don't know. There does seem to be some greater interest in the natural world. It may be just simply like Aristotle says in the Metaphysics, that as society developed, there was more leisure, and so therefore more free time to speculate about the things that were not essential for the necessities of life. I would like to think that is part of it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Please join me and thank Professor Principe once again for his lecture.